I'm here today with Miguel Escobar, author of a new book titled The Unjust Steward, Wealth, Poverty, and the Church Today from Forward Movement. Miguel is executive director of Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. There he works with the Very Reverend Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of EDS at Union, in the formation of social justice faith leaders for the Episcopal Church. Previously, Miguel served as Managing Program Director for Leadership, Communications, and External Affairs at the Episcopal Church Foundation. He earned a Master of Divinity from Union in 2007 and served as the communication assistant to then presiding Bishop Catherine Jeffords Sciori from 2007 to 2010. Miguel is chair of the board of directors of Forward Movement and serves as secretary of the board of directors of Episcopal Relief and Development. He grew up in the Texas Hill Country and attended Our Lady of the Lake University in San Antonio, Texas, where he studied the Roman Catholic social justice tradition, Latin American liberation theologies, and minored in Spanish. Miguel divides his time between two partnered parishes in Brooklyn, New York, All Saints in Park Slope and San Andres in Sunset Park. He lives with his husband, Ben, and dog Duke in Brooklyn. You can learn more at forwardmovement.org. So Miguel, welcome. Thanks for joining us, and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to get to have this conversation.
Well, before we get into the book, what can you tell us about yourself that I didn't already touch on?
Yeah, and it connects to the book and kind of where the book begins. I would, for me, a very critical stepping off point is that I'm the son and grandson of migrant farm workers. My parents were seasonal migrant farm workers in their childhood, and my father part of his adolescence, and moved on into other things. But for my grandparents, it was a significant part of their lives, and also they were immigrants. And the this sort of experience of being the son and grandson of kind of growing up hearing stories about the fields really informs my economic perspective and my understanding of how the church talks about wealth and poverty and the church. And in my own way, or what I hope to do through the book, was to try to write about the history of how the church talks about these issues from that perspective, as the grandchild of migrant farm workers. The other thing is, you mentioned my husband. I'm gay, and I always mention that, both, of course, for social identity purposes, but also because there are economic implications to being a member of the LGBTQ community. Lesbian women in rural areas and transgender community are among the most economically disadvantaged people in the United States. The LGBTQ people are disproportionately represented in the foster care system and among homeless youth. So I always want to emphasize, it's both an identity in many respects, and there's economic implications for this particular identity. And that definitely seeps through the book as well. It's none of those things I guess I deal with directly always, but they're definitely informing my perspective as I try to wrestle with the way that the church has talked about these issues.
And so kind of just from a career trajectory, I mentioned a couple of different places that you were. How did all that happen?
Yeah, I mean, so I graduated from Union Theological Seminary in 2007, became an Episcopalian in 2005, and just immediately this is a gift. The president of Union Seminary recommended me for the office of presiding bishop to work in that office. And I think to connect it to the book, in each of the places that I've been, in working with Bishop Catherine Jeffords Sciori, at the Episcopal Church Foundation and now with EDS at Union, issues of property and of asset management and money and endowment management have all just been incredibly critical and part of the discussion. And I've always just been very interested in hearing how wealth and money is discussed in these meetings. I like to joke that my sort of unofficial title is ecclesiastical bureaucrat because I'm just in a lot of meetings all day, and I'm on these like boards, and and I've been sort of a program officer for a very long time, and I've always just been very fascinated by kind of the not so much the formal theology of how we talk about money, the church talks about money, but kind of the way we talk about it in meetings, the way we talk about it functionally. What are the stories that we tell to kind of explain why we're making the decisions that we're doing.
Interesting. Wow. So before we get into the specifics of the book, a lot of folks probably are not familiar with Forward Movement. And, you've been on the board. They're the ones that published this book. Can you tell us a little bit more about that organization?
Yeah, the mission of Forward Movement is to empower evangelists and inspire disciples. So they like to say they're more than just a publishing company. They're a discipleship making company, and they have a long tradition, particularly of empowering lay discipleship. And so they're the publishers of a little pamphlet that's well known in the Episcopal Church called Forward Day by Day. It's a pamphlet and daily reader that many people receive. And I had the honor, I'm a layperson, and had the honor of serving as the chair for the past couple of years, and really have enjoyed just working with them. And they have also a special focus on Spanish language resources.
Oh,
so
cool.
this book was actually going to also be translated into Spanish, and I'm working with the editor on that material.
Good. So let's get into the book. I mentioned the title is The Unjust Steward, Wealth, Poverty, in the Church Today. When I heard about this topic, I said, okay, I've got to, find out who wrote this and get in touch with them and see if we can do an interview, because, I just think that there's such a ridiculously important topic, how we have just lost track of the whole purpose of Jesus' coming, quite frankly, particularly when it comes to wealth and inequity of wealth. So tell us more about how the book came about.
Yeah, so the book came about, it's been something that's been rumbling in my mind for some time. When I was working for the Episcopal Church Foundation, I used to do presentations across the church on stewardship, which, as I'm sure many people know, is kind of the way the mainline church talks about the responsibility of all of us to be prudent and wise managers of the abundance that God has given us. That's sort of the kind of classic definition of stewardship. And I was doing a presentation in Spanish once, and I used the Spanish word for stewardship, which is mayordomo. And the response was very striking. I got some very quizzical looks back, and eventually one of the participants said, that's a really negative word in Spanish for where I'm coming from.
Really?
Like, I would never want to be a mayordomo. It has all the connotations of overseer and taskmaster that we have in the United States. And it really got me started in looking more deeply at stewards in the gospel. The stewards in the gospel are actually presented very often as a foil character to Jesus. It's a steward in the miracle of the wedding at Cana that comes up to Jesus and says, "Why are you serving the good wine last?" And in the parable of the unjust steward, the steward is exploitative. I mean, he's literally unjust. He's pressing workers into debt bondage. And his salvation comes by actually reversing his master's wealth and releasing it for debt relief. It's actually an act of anti-stewardship that really saves him. And so it really got me started on this sort of line of thinking of like, how did we end up with sort of this doctrine of stewardship? How did we end up praising stewards? And interestingly, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote an essay, a very short essay on this in 1930 called "Is Stewardship Ethical?" And what he does is he traces our love of stewardship in the mainline church to the wealth managers at the time who were, very much kind of in charge of mainline or very ascendant in mainline Christianity. And he really critiques the doctrine of stewardship and says, like, this is not a good way for us to talk about wealth. And it ignores the long biblical and theological tradition of critiquing sources of wealth and sort of what are the ethical obligations that come with wealth. We're not actually called to be asset managers. We're actually called to be really almost kind of almost irresponsibly generous. There's this one thinker who uses the word promiscuous generosity. And he says that Jesus is promiscuously generous. And I love that term because you so oftentimes see Jesus and he's being like, people are literally offended or scandalized by how generous he is being. So there's not really as much of a tradition, I would say, for the kind of prudent management that we oftentimes sort of say there is. And I just find, like, I'm an Anglican, so I always try to hold these things in tension rather than saying one or the other. I think it's just important to have us be in conversation with the gospel and the examples that we see there. I'm not prepared to throw away stewardship, but I also think like there's a lot within the gospel and tradition that critiques this model too. So
interesting. Wow. Yeah. Well, I've seen the term stewardship used very positively, kind of in my relatively recent learning, quite frankly. There was a really good article written completely outside of the church, a completely business-oriented, secular article about marketing. And it was using the analogy of servant leadership to basically serve your audience, right? That any business, that has the blessing of some customers, right, needs to figure out how to serve those customers well. And it talks about stewardship in that context. Like you've been, like just like your email followers or your Facebook followers, where you've been blessed with some following, you need to think about how to serve them well. Right. So that's one context in which, stewardship has been applied to something that I hadn't thought of before,
and Basil of, so this goes to like chapter 18, that Basil of Caesarea, he uses the term to say, we are called not to be stewards of wealth, but rather stewards of humanity. And his point is, in so much as we are in charge of institutions or have assets to manage, we should be leveraging those to actually serve our neighbors, serve our communities. He was preaching during a time of famine, and he was literally preaching that to the wealthy of Caesarea. So his argument is, let's not be stewards of wealth, let's be stewards of humanity. Wow. Which I think is a very positive read of what it means to be a steward.
That's great. Another one that, I'm very familiar with, I had the honor of working for Frederick Buechner for several years. And he relates the story of him talking about, in front of an audience at Laity Lodge, actually, an audience of people where he was describing, his father's suicide and how, that had been a very, very long-lasting, painful experience for his family. And, just other things that that he'd gone through. And someone came up to him afterward and said, "You've been a very good steward of your pain." And he had never thought of that concept before. So he later on wrote a whole essay, that's part of some of his books now, called The Stewardship of Pain.
Wow.
And, this whole concept of, again, you've been given this, hard to call it a gift, but you've been given something in your life, right? And you can choose what to do or not do with that. And so it's just a really compelling, to me it was, what I read, there's very compelling school of thought.
And it really, I mean, it that brings me back to even the parable of the unjust steward. Because like in this parable, Jesus says one of the most perplexing lines that people have really struggled with, which is like, we should take unrighteous mammon, the unrighteous mammon that we've been given, and turn it outward to serve others, basically. And it's a very powerful reflection about, like, sometimes the way we receive what we receive is terrible, actually. I mean, it's unrighteous. It's a tragedy, and yet he finds his salvation by turning it outward.
Wow. Wow.
And that, I think, is really the heart of the parable, which ends with Jesus saying, we have to decide what we're going to serve. Are we going to serve wealth, or are we going to serve God?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the kind of crux of how, I think that's the exciting part of this project. It's like, let's dig into this parable. Let's dig into the tradition, because it broadens and complicates the way we talk about wealth.
So can you talk a little bit about how the book is organized?
Sure. So what I did was, I basically, there are 24 chapters, and each chapter is a snapshot of a text, a homily, a person who talked about wealth, poverty, and money over the course of the first 5 centuries. So I began with Jesus, and the Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke, and I end with Augustine of Hippo. And I sort of did it in this snapshot way, in part because, I wanted to see how the evolution of thought occurred. And what you do is you really do get to start to see, like, oh wow, already by the 2nd century, you have some elite theologians, trying to figure out how to make sure wealthy people are able to keep their assets and are fully welcomed into the church. And then, wow, by the 5th century, we really have Augustine in particular. You really have the arguments that we still carry today, of an understanding of how we understand wealth, for our understanding of the parable of the rich young man and ruler. He lays out an understanding of Lazarus and the rich man, which really undoes the reversal. That's Lazarus at the gate and the rich man. That kind of undoes the reversal. By the time you get to Augustine, you have kind of the still prevailing arguments that we have today, and the organization of the chapters is you can see a progression, as well as some counter movements in the ascetic tradition, that are really wrestling with this. The end result, I think, is that I really try to, like, muddy the waters around how we talk about this, but I don't necessarily end up with, like, a central thesis. I just sort of, I really try to, like, say, hey, there are actually a lot of complicated ways in which the church has talked about these issues. And there are a lot of different voices, and we need to be paying attention to these different voices.
So the book description that I got offline, it says, The Unjust Steward presents a compelling case for a profound overhaul in the way the church and its people value the poor and transform into servants of God instead of stewards of wealth. So it talks about transformation of the church.
Yeah.
What about beyond that? I mean, it feels as though, we need a way beyond just the church.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I mean, I think the the origins of this book are mentioning um, I have a lot to do with the pandemic. I mean, I was it was April 2020. I was blessed to be able to work from home. I live in Brooklyn, New York, uh, and in April and May, the pandemic was really hitting New York particularly. So I would go on walks with my dog and saw the morgue trucks, walk by the morgue trucks outside the hospital all the time. I saw the long lines of people waiting for food. The whole economic system around me was collapsing. Uh, Stores were emptied out on the streets. Um, uh, I live by a bunch of hotels that became homeless shelters because we have 60,000 people in our city who live in the shelter system, including about 20,000 kids. And I believe the number is about 400,000. I hope that's right. About 400,000 people from the wealthiest zip codes just left the city. They left to second homes
Yep.
Elsewhere, and so who remains, right? And you can see also in congregations who was dying, and where the people were dying disproportionately in the outer boroughs. It all depended about insurance, So it was a very stark time in terms of seeing how these wealth and poverty divides were becoming exacerbated, and then also were leading literally to death, to increased mortality among poor communities. And at that time, I began reading a homily that I mentioned by Basil of Caesarea, called which was a homily to the wealthy during a time of natural disaster. He preached a series of sermons during a time of famine, and it was very strongly directed toward the wealthy in the community about what it means to retain wealth at a time in which people are starving, and how God was asking them to, in fact, release wealth. And it's just this extended meditation on money as a form of medicine in a time of suffering. And it's an incredible homily. And for me, it was really an example of what the church's role is in terms of larger society at this moment. I think we need to have bishops and other faith leaders really step into the role that Basil of Caesarea did and speak to humanity, to society, to a city about what its responsibility is to the poor particularly during a time of natural disaster. This was also the same period of years in which we saw people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, take rocket ships into space, and it's again just very, very striking to think about those actions whenever global poverty has been, thinking of the Spanish word, global poverty has been retrograded, 20 years of progress.
Yeah.
And so, like, to imagine that people are spending billions of dollars personal,
I was
individual.
like, is that how you really want to spend your money?
Yeah,
No,
it's
it's just like,
just an
really?
incredible time. So anyway, so that yeah, like so it's an opportunity to dig into our churches, our history, and hear many voices who do talk about particularly inequality in the world.
So I'd like to read a couple of endorsements for the book. This one is from Kelly Brown Douglas, who you work with.
Yeah.
And we recently interviewed for her recent book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. She says, this book is an absolute must read for anyone who has ever wondered what the Bible really says about economic injustice and the wealth gap. So your book is very timely, I think because, something we've talked about is badly needed. But, why do you suppose that this is the case right now? This wealth gap has gotten worse. I mean, independent just a pandemic, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah. That is a really great question. Like, why has it gotten so bad now? I'm not sure I can answer that like I'm not an economist, but I think I can say just like from a church perspective or Christian perspective, I think the church hasn't done its job over the past century of remembering the economic justice message that we're supposed to be preaching to society. There's certain, let's just say even with thinking about Christianity in general, there's certainly a version of Christianity which celebrates wealth and sees it as a blessing. I'm actually not even just talking about them. I'm talking about like the Episcopalians. I'm talking about the Presbyterian, the mainline. I'm not sure that we have been faithful stewards of the traditions which critique wealth. And here's an example of something very specific. One of the most powerful, most impactful economic statements in the Gospels is Jesus saying that we should lend without interest. Douglas Meeks says that is the singular most important statement that Jesus makes that impacts economics from the first century all the way through the Reformation. The reason why Jesus says that is because of predatory lending and because what happens to people who are the victims of predatory lending. He is speaking from the perspective grounded in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which equates predatory lending with enslavement. And God is the God of freedom. This is the God who frees us from slavery. At some point, we just stopped talking about usury and predatory lending, and we really just, we lost that tradition, and we really shouldn't. Predatory lending is alive and very real. I mean, the 2008 crash was caused by various forms of predatory lending. And that is something we really, really need to step up on and engage more directly. And that's just one example. We have a rich tradition of speaking about economic justice issues. And unfortunately, I don't think we have many Basil of Caesareas who are willing to speak to the lenders and the wealthy of their communities in quite so direct terms.
Yeah, I need to look up this homily that you're describing and read that. So here's a quote from Michael Curry. He says, here's a book that inspires, yes, but also challenges and unsettles all who would take seriously Jesus' way of love. Weaving together words of wisdom from spiritual giants of early Christianity with profound reflections on his own life, Miguel Escobar pulls back the curtain of wealth and poverty, reveal our long-standing complicity with systems of injustice, and calls us to make better, more humane choices, reflective of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth that can change the world. So what I'd really like to ask you about there is, kind of the, when he says, calls us to make better, more humane choices. So, I think I've related to you before. I really like books that are very practical.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of have a, what do we do about it aspect of it. So what can you say, or what does your book say about the whole what do we do about it in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mentioned Forward Movement at the top. In working with Scott Gunn, who's the executive director of Forward Movement, I would send him like example chapters, and he would give me some really good feedback about how to make it a congregational resource. Because I'm kind of a heady person and I like ideas, And so we had this really great collaboration where he helped me kind of focus it in such a way that hopefully it would be a helpful resource for congregations. So the books so that each chapter is about 3,000 to 4,000 words. And at the end of it, each chapter, I have discussion questions with small groups, and then a practical next step offered. So like on the chapter I wrote a chapter on kind of the long history of the teachings around predatory lending. And, and at the end of it, I sort of, hopefully, if there's a group or an individual who's engaging in group discussion, there's some questions. And then I think the follow-up is to just learn more about like examples of credit unions that exist within their denominations. Like the Episcopal Church has a credit union in the Diocese of Los Angeles, a federal credit union, and which makes loans and things like that. And the history is very interesting. So there's a lot of just sort of like follow up, learn more. What are examples of ways in which churches are actually doing this, such as denominational credit unions as well. So, yeah.
Good. Cool. So I know you're in the midst of, launching this brand new book, but looking forward, I mean, are there any other projects that you have in mind for the future that you're able to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, and I haven't just finished, so I haven't quite brought my energy up to the next project. But I mean, one thing that I'm really struck by is like this is organized in, as I said, 24 chapters going through the first 5 centuries of Christianity. I'm conscious of the fact that most clergy, their day-to-day struggle is like, how do you talk about these issues in the context of the lectionary? And so one of the things that I'm thinking about is like, what if I were to look through the lectionary and pick out the text that deals specifically with wealth, poverty, and money, and use that as a jumping off point to talk about some of this history.
Sure.
Reverse the structure. Because I think that would be a very useful resource for a clergy person who has to talk about the pearl of great price, which is actually has a beautiful long history in terms of how that was used to talk about wealth in the church, or pull down your barns. So like, I think that would be a very useful resource to work on.
Cool. Wonderful. Well, again, the name of the new book is The Unjust Steward, Wealth, Poverty, and the Church Today. You can learn more about it at forwardmovement.org. Miguel, thanks so much for this work. I think it's really important. I really appreciate you, taking the time to, share your insights about this with our audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you.